I have to say, one of my fondest memories was when we were thinking about doing the Climate Adaptation Center, and our realtor, Elizabeth and mine, we didn't know each other yet, and she just said, hey, you guys need to meet each other. And I said, well, who is she? And she said, you just all say the same thing over and over and over again, the two of you. Like, I feel like she's the other side. And so I said, well, I feel a little weird about calling somebody, on the fly like this. And she said, no, don't worry about it. I got your number. Boy, does she ever have my number. So anyway, a week or so later, Elizabeth calls and she said, hey, what are you doing? Let's meet for a cocktail, but I don't have very much time because I'm going to ballroom dancing tonight. Do you remember that? And anyway, so we went to the now defunct Cafe Europe, which has been flooded by the hurricane. And I walked in there, and then Elizabeth walked in her ballroom dress. And for the first time in my life, I was speechless. And I said, you definitely have to be on my board of directors. So Elizabeth is one of our founding directors, and the other one happens to be in the other corner, Dan Digraph in the back. And these are two amazing people who helped bring the CAC to fruition, and we really so appreciate that. I'm going to talk today about migration. This is something I think is a very important mental health issue. It's an emerging issue. It's happening already, and we need to really understand the nomenclature of what we're doing here. So, what is climate migration? It's a consequence of climate warming. And it's simply the movement of people that are forced to move because of some event. And migration is a negative thing in some ways, and it's a positive thing because it spurs change, the change that we sorely need. And we haven't had the opportunity yet or the reason to react. But with these storms, it's bad, but it is also an opportunity for us to change the future. So, this is the way the Climate Center looks at problems. We look at the silver lining on the other side. There's so much grief we have to go through to get there. But when we get to the other side, we can have a more sustainable society. And that's what we're trying to do here. So there's really no good definition of climate migration, but we really need one. For example, in 2022, 3.2 million US adults really had to move, and 50% of them moved permanently. So that's over 1.5 million people moved permanently from where they were to some new place because of some climate issue. So we directly need to measure the source of these migrants and where they're coming from. And we don't have a good measuring system. I'm an atmospheric scientist, a climatologist, and I can't go from point A to point B until I know where point A is. I have to know what the condition is right now before I can forecast the future. And many of you will see in our hurricane forecast, for example, I said, well, the center hasn't formed yet, so I can't tell you where it's going to go. Where everybody else is doing spaghetti models and all of that other stuff. I don't worry about it until there's a center, because once I know where it is, then I can tell you where it's going to go. And this is where we are in our society today. We're moving around and we're making adjustments, and we don't really even know where we are yet. So here's an example of where these people are moving to. Some are gone from their site for less than a week. That's displacement, that's migration. There's Sometimes we put these two things together. They're really different things. And then 1 to 6 months, 200,000 of those people, those 3.2 million people, were displaced for that kind of period. And some people are, so you can see there's a whole cascade of different outcomes for different people, and it's all considered climate migration. It's really not. So there's the two parts of it, right? The displacement and permanent relocation. And we need to start distinguishing between the two because they're totally different problems, right? They're similar, but they're different, and we need to measure both. So one of the things we want to see our governments do is start to put some definition on these things and start to measure these things directly, just like we measure the temperature every day. So our public policies sometimes inhibit climate adaptation. And I think Judy was saying this earlier, but I thought, oh my God, here's that quote. FEMA is a positive enterprise, and they try to do good work, but they provide limitless flood insurance to people who are being wiped out over and over again. Where does that money come from? You know, raise your hands, everybody. Okay? So we want them to be able to do these programs, but when it gets to a certain point where 2 or 3 times a year people are being wiped out by flood insurance and they get paid over and over again to rebuild what they have, is that the kind of change that we want in the future? Is this the way we're going to adapt? We have to use the money we have to make the adaptations we can, and we can't have the government being in the way of that adaptation. We need to rethink some of these things now before we run out of money completely, right? So we're here to talk about 2050. The CAC made the first forecast ever made for a community about what it was going to look like in 2050. Why doesn't every community have a climate weather forecast for 2050? Because if people had those things, then they would anticipate the changes and they would move because they're smart. But if they don't know, we create this unknowingness and nothing happens. So the location will reshape where people live, where communities live, and this is how we will change our world. So there's 2 kinds of migration. There's internal and international. On the international scene, we have seen people moving into our country because of climate disasters in other places. We've seen huge amounts of migration into our country over the last 10 years, year after year. But how many of these people are climate migrants? We don't know. We don't know why they're coming. It's not a question people coming into our country are asked. One question, one policy change, we could know that number every single year, but nobody's asking. I don't understand that. So climate migration forecast map, okay? So you see those green areas up there? This is a climate forecast map of what it's going to look like in 2050 as people start moving from the southern parts of our world into more northerly areas. So we've had a huge migration into Florida since 1990. But by 2050, those arrows may change the other direction, okay? These are trends that we think will happen. There's no reason for it to be a surprise. So we get out in front of the trend. We don't follow the trend. We get out in front of the trend. That's where our leverage is. That's where our investment should be. Because every dollar we invest on the front end is going to save $15 or $20 on the back end. And that's how we can use the money we have better. So we have migration from Latin America and the Caribbean. There's a lot of people that are going to be coming here because of disasters and political instability and, uninhabitable conditions due to increasing heat. So these are threats, but they're also opportunities for us to prepare for what's coming and know what's coming. We already know what's coming. It's like, do we need a hurricane warning? We don't, because this is happening. Now, here's an example of that. This was 2020. It could be this year. This was our last La Nina year, 2020. And all of those past, there are hurricanes, and look where they formed. Exactly where Sarah formed. Exactly where Helene formed. Exactly where Burl went through. And this is a hot spot, right? And these storms tend to come up into the Gulf of Mexico or go into Central America. And in 2020, we had 2 hurricanes that were Category 4 or 5 strike the same point in 7 days. In Nicaragua and Honduras, and 2 years later, we had hundreds of thousands of people coming from those 2 countries into the United States. Were they climate migrants? Nobody knows. But the cause and effect would suggest that hundreds of thousands of them were. It takes time for them to come, but we know they're going to come, and we could have been more ready for that climate migration by understanding how climate interacts with our migration trends. So, and then there's the internal migration into our own country. There's climate-induced and permanently relocation. These are 2 different things where people flee a storm and they're displaced for a while, and then they come back to their normal places after they rebuild, and some just can't do it anymore, and so they go to new places. So in our internal migration, we have within the nation, within the states, and within our high-risk communities. And so everybody has a different point of recognition of the threat. And you have to think about what is your own point of recognition. For me, it was 5 years ago. For me, and I'll get back to that in a second, but public investments to support and protect people in climate vulnerable areas is really an important thing to understand. And how many resources that we can put, who gets these resources? So if you look at this, you can see how migrants are coming into the country are kind of related to the number of climate events we have. The higher the number, the higher the migration is. So this isn't a surprise, but we kind of know the general trends. We could know a lot more about the specifics of this if we measured it differently. So this is a problem, right? Our point of recognition. I love this picture. It's so telling for what we've seen right here. For some, it's not happening right now after 3 major hurricanes in 65 days. They still haven't had the point of recognition. And part of this is because we take the inertia of the past into the future. What we knew when we were young, when we were children, we would recover, we would rebuild. If you talk to people right after, oh yeah, we're going to be resilient, we're going to rebuild, we're going to do whatever we're going to do. But now we have all this information that can inform those decisions so that better decisions are made. As heartbreaking as it is to leave a place, isn't it better in the long run to reestablish your life in a way that you can be happy and healthy and and protected from these things in the future. So, for some it hasn't happened yet, but all of us are going to have this, and you can see all of these different possibilities where that point of recognition is going to come in. Extreme temperatures are really driving all these impacts. We would not have a change in the climate if we didn't have a change in the temperature, and so that's what's happening. Whoops. Okay. So what I really want to say, the migration drivers really are sea level rise, all right? We've had roughly, since 2000 to 2023, 7 inches of sea level rise. That's an astounding amount of sea level rise that we've had since 2020. When you only have 4 or 5 feet of buffer and you lose 7 inches of it, think about that. Almost 20% of our buffer has disappeared since 2000. And we're forecasting another 10, 11 inches of sea level rise by 2050. This isn't a far away time. This is like in our lifetimes for many of us. So you can read on here all the different ways we've sliced and diced this, but the sea level rise is accelerating, and it's because the oceans have gotten warmer and they're expanding, and now we're losing ice at a record rate. And this is a nightmare. We've had 10 major hurricanes in 7 years hit the Gulf Coast, and I mean 3, 4, or 5 hurricanes. And the entire Gulf Coast is a bathtub in the summertime. That's why we have really record warm sea surface temperatures, and it's rocket fuel for these storms. Judy was talking about rapidly intensifying hurricanes. We've been talking about that for years. And back in 2018, when we started talking about them, we had some that were doing that, but now almost everyone is doing that. So when you see these impacts all on one slide here, you've got to ask yourself, what is your point of recognition? What is it going to take for us to get out in front of this? What does this really mean? So 5 years ago, I lived on the other side of that arrow. And my point of recognition came because I knew this was going to come. I didn't know exactly what year, how many storms we'd have in 1 year and whatever. But I got uncomfortable, and I moved to downtown Sarasota, to the highest building base in all of Sarasota. So that was my decision to make 5 years ago. So I had that point of recognition then. And I am a climate migrant. I didn't move out of the country. I didn't move out of the state, but I moved within our community to a place where I thought I personally would not have to suffer the stresses of what a lot of people are suffering right now. But I'm suffering the stresses with everybody, because every single person I know has some of these stresses. They've lost homes. I have a family member who has PTSD from watching this happen and is not here today because of it. And we're all having different impacts from it. So coastal regions and sea level rise, you can see, acting with knowledge can change and protect our tax base. People sometimes say, well, we can't afford it. My answer is we cannot afford not to. If we lose our tax bases in our communities, we won't be able to be resilient. So the whole point is that some of these changes that we need to make in these areas that are getting flooded all the time are not happy changes to have to make, but we have more capacity to do that right now than we're ever going to have. So we should really think about what we're doing right now. On St. Armand's Circle, I'm just going to say 5 floods in 1 year. People are still putting drywall into these stores 1 foot above concrete. I mean, is that I mean, we can make different choices, but we have to start thinking about what choices do we really have? We have so many choices that we can make about how we do this. Maybe some of those stores should be elevated. Do we have to lose John Ringling Circle? No. But how many businesses can go through this year after year? What if this keeps happening? It may not happen next year, it may be 2 years. But the time for adaptation and smart thinking is right now. And this is the reason why. We've had an incredible human migration into Florida. The population of Florida has gone up more than 100% since 1990. That's an incredible thing. And everybody wants to be in this beautiful area that we call paradise, right? I love it. That's why I'm here. I love our environment. But we have this triple thing going on. More storms, more people, and, higher sea level. And this is like the trifecta, just like we had in hurricanes here. So we have to understand the nature of our paradise and how to manage it better. It doesn't mean we have to move away. It doesn't mean we have to have a worse life. It means we'll have a better life, a more sustainable life, if we do it and we do it well. So this is the I call it the vicious circle of development. And you'll see we have extreme weather events, property destruction, clean up and restore, and then a beautiful life until the next event. Unfortunately, in 3 months, we had 3 events. We didn't even get a chance to get back to where we were before we were in it again 3 times. Okay, this has been an unprecedented hurricane season, okay? We thought it was going to really be bad, and it unfortunately is worse than I expected. And so, but this is the way we've done things when we had a stable climate, because the revisit time was long, and we felt safe taking that risk. Now we know that's not true anymore. Look at this. Since 2019, why are we doing this? Think about that. It's just that the numbers are just staggering. Now, here's what we should be doing, okay? It's still a vicious circle, but this one has positive feedback mechanisms, okay, for our tax base. So we're going to have frequently bad weather events here. That's just the nature of where we are right now in the climate cycle. We're going to have property destruction, but we can clean up and build up as we go along. So know your elevation, and let's get to higher elevation. I don't mean that in the sense that you have to move from the spot you're in. If you can afford to build up, that's fine. If you cannot afford to build up, maybe it's time to move to a higher elevation. And we got to break this cycle. This is our new reality, and our building permits should be structured so that people sign a risk statement before they're allowed to be rebuilt, where they actually are told what the risk is. And if they sign the paper and then they want to build back, that's fine. But maybe they don't get flood insurance the next time. Maybe we use some of that money on more productive uses than rebuilding something we know is going to be destroyed again. Again, it's a 10 to 15 to 1 return on investment by getting in front of this trend rather than just keep doing the same old thing and having the same old thing happen over and over again. So it's emotional and it's financial. So should folks leave Florida, or should they just leave the coast? What is the impact of rising heat indexes? What adaptations do they demand? Our choices, whether they're advertent or inadvertent, are still choices. A choice not made is a choice. It's a choice to stay where we are and hope that something is going to change. So our tax base is a driver of our way of life. Our insurance indicators are all flashing red. What's happening is a lot of people can't afford to rebuild because they can't afford the insurance, even if they can afford to rebuild. Insurance is increasingly limiting our choices. So the opportunity we have is to protect the tax base on our barrier islands if we do the right climate adaptations in infrastructure building. Over 100 or 200 years, the sea level is going to continue to rise. But for another 100 years, we have choices that we can use these areas and use them productively. So rule number one as an entrepreneur, this was drilled into me. You can make a lot of mistakes if they're affordable mistakes. The only rule you have to keep, do not run out of money. The second rule, do not run out of money. So if you want to be a good entrepreneur, do not run out of money. And that's what we all must be in this time that we're living in. So a phased retreat really is what's happening. So escalating losses is having its impacts, and there's a wealth shift. People who cannot afford the risk are going to move to other places, and people who can afford the risk are going to move in. So in a way, the cycle that we're going to see is actually going to be more wealth by people who can afford to take the risk on the barrier islands. We're not deserting the barrier islands, but the change of the people who actually decide to live there is going to change. And the services that those people are going to want, will be able to afford to build. At some point, long term, that'll be the last part of this cycle. So we have to understand what's happening and why it's happening. And, people will say, well, the poor people can't go to the beach. Well, I'm one of those poor people compared to a lot of people that live out there. And I go to the beach. I live downtown and I go to the beach. The beach is going to be there 95% of the time, but for the other 5% of the time, I'm not being there. So we need to adapt now for a more resilient future. We really, really need to immediately adapt because our viability is going to be increased by doing it now. It's a challenging path. Some will leave, but proactive adaptation will increase our quality of life and not diminish it. So this is my last slide. We really have to focus on our vulnerable populations, right? Because as we've heard so many times today, these are the people that don't get to make the choices we get. We're having trouble making the choices, and we can afford, for the most part, to make them. They don't have the choices. And so we have to be the stewards for them, to help them understand the risk and to help organize our more vulnerable populations so that they're safe and in good places. Not in the cheapest land that can flood the easiest that we see where a lot of these low-income housing developments are going, because we know these are not sustainable. We should not be doing that anymore to exacerbate a problem that's already bad. So anyway, that's my speech as a businessman and as a person who really cares about it. There's a little science in there, but that's how I see it. looking at it from a climate scientist and entrepreneur's point of view. Thank you very much.